seconds.
Welcome to another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for today's program. Joining me are the usual suspects, Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University and also is a city commissioner in the city of Kalamazoo. And another regular on the program is Felix Brooks. Felix is an adjunct professor in the Department of Sociology at Western and also is the director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. And we'd like to welcome as a special guest today Ed Martini. Ed is a professor of history at Western Michigan University. Previously served as associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. He's an expert on the Viet Nam War and has written a number of incredibly important books on this topic. Just to name a couple of them: Invisible Enemies, The American War on Vietnam. He's written an excellent book on Agent Orange. And he's currently working on another book. He's got a couple other books I won't mention, but he's got a new book in process dealing with the issue of napalm. So, Ed, welcome to Critical Issues. Glad to have you on the program.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And we're at the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, as some would put it, or the reunification of Vietnam, as others would put it. But we're also at the 50th anniversary of the real escalation of the war. 1965, after Lyndon Johnson, the peace candidate in the 1964 election, was safely reelected and starting his term in his own right. The war dramatically escalated. It was that year, I believe, that Operation Rolling Thunder, the campaign to start bombing North Vietnam, started. So we really see a dramatic escalation of the war 50 years ago right now. To talk about the Vietnam War and its impact, its continuing impact, the legacies of the war, I think we first have to go back and talk a little bit about the history, going back even before 1965. So Ed, do you want to kind of give us a quick background to how the United States got there in the first place?
Sure. I mean, there's so many different starting points you could have, but as we were just chatting about, probably the most direct entry point, which most people don't know, and Felix was talking about earlier, was that the United States had been allied with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh during World War II, that after several unsuccessful attempts to bring the United States onto their side in their quest for independence going back to World War I, and consistently being rebuffed by American leaders going back to Woodrow Wilson. We had finally allied with the Ho Chi Minh and with, especially using the Office for Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA, to gather intelligence in the Pacific War during World War II, since the Japanese were then occupying most of Southeast Asia. So where the U.S. really begins to diverge from that path, though, is then after World War II. The Vietnamese had hoped that we would continue to support their quest for independence, but instead, because the United States was focused on rebuilding Japan and in its capitalist image after World War II, and then also needed the French support with NATO and things that would come later during the Cold War, the United States instead sort of sold the Vietnamese down the river and supported the French effort to recolonize Vietnam, leading to what we call the First Indochina War from 1945 to 1954. And although the United States didn't commit troops to that, by the end of the war, the United States was paying for 75% of it, considered sending nuclear weapons to that, and after the French were defeated by the Viet Minh, the revolutionary forces of Vietnam, at Dien Bien Phu in 54, the United States essentially took over that struggle, and then over the next 10 years or so, gradually under Eisenhower, and then under Kennedy, and then under Johnson, continued to increase its financial support, its military support, to the point where it completely took over the war, essentially, in 1965.
And prior to that, we were sending military advisors, right?
Right, lots of military aid, lots of equipment, and advisors, some of whom were actual advisors, but a lot of whom were, of course, special forces and doing all sorts of things under there that helped escalate the war as well.
Yeah, I remember seeing some maps when I was a kid, and on the map it was the French Indochina. Sort of an unusual ring to our ears today, French Indochina, as if the French
had been there for what, 6 decades? Up until they left in 53, 54?
Yeah, they first really colonized it in about the 1880s. Yeah.
And then it was in 54 when the French left and we essentially take over. But it's at that point that the country is divided into North and South, right?
Right.
Now, the idea was, though, that there would be an election that would come up, and the country would be reunified, right?
Exactly.
And so what happened?
Well,
The election was never held, was it?
Well, there was an election
There
of
was
sorts, yeah. So in 1954, there's a big conference in Geneva, and they were still sorting out issues from the Korean War at that point. And so one of the issues to be discussed among China, Soviet Union, England, France, the United States, and others who were there was what to do with Indochina as well. And so after the French were defeated, they put a temporary dividing line, the key word being temporary, right there, dividing into North and South, and basically said,
17th parallel,
yep, and go back to your corners, and in 2 years, in 1956, we'll have an election, and whatever the Vietnamese people determine they want their future to be, so be it. Well, it became pretty clear to everyone right away that Ho Chi Minh, who by that time had solidified his alliance with Communist China and with the Communist forces, whereas before he'd been much more open to American support and American ideas. By that time, it was pretty clear that Ho Chi Minh would win that election in a runaway, and so that was too dangerous for the United States. And so instead of waiting for the election in '56, the United States and its South Vietnamese allies held a special referendum in the South only in 1955. And Ngo Dinh Diem, who had been a long time supported by the United States, by the American Friends of Vietnam, John Kennedy as a senator was very supportive of that. A lot of Catholic support because Diem was a Catholic. They held an election and Diem won something along the lines of 105% of the votes in South Vietnam. Yeah, vote early and often. And so with that, they essentially created this country called South Vietnam, which had never existed before. It would only exist for 20 years until the fall of Saigon in 1975. So this thing called the Republic of Vietnam was a complete fiction. It was a complete creation. But that was then used to justify further American involvement. Now that there was this independent country called South Vietnam, any communist in the South or any communist activity in the country, any revolutionary activity, was then seen as a communist invasion. So it was essentially created to justify the Cold War narrative of a worldwide struggle against communism, when in fact what was going on was a struggle for independence, and if anything, a civil war in Vietnam rather than this global infiltration of communism.
And what's interesting is, this whole notion of Americans trying to spread democracy throughout the world. We see the same situation in Vietnam as we saw in Iraq in the 50s when they tried to install a democratic government that wasn't necessarily going to be friendly towards us, and we made sure that that didn't happen. And that's what happened in Vietnam. That's why that whole split between the North and the South took place.
Yeah,
and that was the same time that the overthrow of Arbenz was taking place in Guatemala, right?
Yep.
Right.
That's all, the Dulles brothers and the CIA and their policies, that they developed during that time.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people trace Vietnam back to the 50s, but of course you have to.
Yeah.
And
that was really the key, and as we often do, the United States backed the wrong horse. They selected this leader Diem, who had been trained in the United States, had a lot of ties to the French, was Catholic in a country that's
Buddhist.
overwhelmingly Buddhist, was incredibly wealthy in a country that's overwhelmingly poor, had no support among the people, similar to the folks we installed in Guatemala and in Iran. No popular support.
And then I think we eventually, and I'm sure you can verify this, we eventually were heavily involved in the coup that ended up overthrowing him.
Yeah. A lot of people like to portray Diem as a puppet during that time, when in fact he was anything but a puppet. He consistently refused the advice of the Kennedy administration. The Eisenhower administration would not engage in land reform, would not scale back the pretty brutal secret police force that we helped create in South Vietnam. And so he had no popular support. And eventually then, at the beginning of November 1963, President Kennedy gave the green light to a coup that eventually murdered Diem and his brother, who had led the secret police force. And then 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was assassinated.
Noam Chomsky sometimes refers to the American invasion of Vietnam, and I think people always sort of take a look at him like that's a funny phrase, but to some extent that's what it was. But the fiction of South Vietnam allowed us to paper that over and to show that we were going to the aid of an ally rather than trying to assert our own colonial control, imperial control in Vietnam.
Which is a common theme in U.S. foreign policy. As long as there's somebody there, in a lot of cases somebody we've installed, as long as somebody invites you, then it's not an invasion, right? We've created this kind of small group of people who support the United States and increased U.S. involvement. Therefore, it's not an invasion. But in fact, that's what it is. It's a gradual invasion, and then beginning in March 1965 with the Marines at Da Nang, it's a full-scale, it's essentially an occupation of South Vietnam with the fiction of the South Vietnamese government and really a loosely bound together South Vietnamese army as well.
And that's where, in '65 that's where Caputo, that's when he served in Da Nang, and that's where he wrote his book from that 18 or 16 months that he spent in Vietnam during that time. Because that's when the war was escalated. That was after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and all that stuff. So
Let's talk a little bit about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the congressional resolution that followed, because to some extent that provided Lyndon Johnson with sort of a blank check to do whatever he wanted to do, which led to the escalation 50 years ago in 1965. So most of the observers now contend that the incident of the Gulf of Tonkin either didn't happen or certainly didn't happen in the way in which the U.S. portrayed it, right?
Yeah, it certainly didn't happen in the way that the U.S. portrayed it, which was as this act of aggression by the North Vietnamese, which was anything from the case. The United States had been engaging in very provocative counterintelligence raids along the coastline, was essentially picking a fight with the North Vietnamese there. The U.S. Navy was constantly agitating. And then when the attack in August of 1964 actually occurred, there were two separate attacks. And initially it was thought that one was completely fabricated, whereas another took place. And there's still millions of declassified pages of documents that we don't know exactly what happened. But it's certainly not in the way that it was portrayed. And at least one of the attacks in question did not happen at all. But it was framed, and they had a resolution ready to go for the escalation of the war, and the Senate voted 98-2, almost unanimously, to authorize action. And as you said, Ron, it was completely a blank check, very open-ended, basically allowed the president to do whatever he wanted at the time, and in that way really the lesson that we didn't learn later on, same kind of resolution that comes in after 9/11, a complete open-ended blank check with no end in sight and no exit strategy.
Yeah, I mean, congressional capitulation, congressional abdication of its constitutional responsibility to declare war.
Absolutely.
And from this point on, you have to go back to World War II to see a congressional declaration of war. And in the Cold War era, Congress just gives up this power, and the growth of the executive and the ability of the executive to wage war, always with the veneer of an incident like this where they gain some kind of resolution.
Exactly.
It's sort of a mini version of 9/11.
Yep.
I mean, different context, different time, not the 24-hour news cycle that we have today, but the impact was the same in terms of giving Johnson the ability to be able to escalate the war as a result of that, and have that 98-2 vote.
Right. And it's all about fear. Yep. It's all about scare. We have to do this to protect ourselves because they're going to move in, the communists are going to move in, take all over Southeast Asia, and then we're going to be
Well, that was the whole, and again, Professor Martini knows it's the whole domino effect.
Right.
That, when I was a kid growing up, that's all I heard about was that effect that if we allowed the South Vietnam to fall, the entire area is going to cave in.
Yep. Yeah.
So now we're in 1965. Things start to heat up. More troops are sent over. There's no pretense now that these are advisors, right? We're sending troops over there. We start carrying out the bombing raids in North Vietnam. One of the things that I learned from Christian Appy's book, which I want to mention in a little while, but Christian Appy, who's a friend of yours, American Reckoning, the Vietnam War and Our National Identity. I'm on screen. Let me put it up there. So, Christian Appy, great book, fantastic details about the war. And Appy covers what we've sort of outlined here, the history, then the conduct of the war, and then we want to get to the legacies of it. But one of the things that Appy taught me, and I didn't remember, I guess, was that so much of the bombing took place in the South.
Right.
We were always thinking about Operation Rolling Thunder, and of course then later Nixon's Christmas time bombing of Hanoi. But most of the bombing took place in the South.
Absolutely.
So what was going on? Why was there so much necessity from the military perspective to bomb in South Vietnam?
Well, the revolution that the United States was essentially trying to quell in Vietnam was going on in the South. That after we artificially divided the country and then went to war to defend that division, the revolution that was going on in the South, we portrayed it as a war of external aggression, but in fact it was an internal revolution going on in the country, and that's where most of the revolutionaries came from. Over the course of the war, more and more troops and support came down from North Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and so the trail itself was bombed a lot. But most of the targets for what we came to call the Viet Cong, they were called at the time the National Liberation Front for South Vietnam, most of those folks were living in the South. And so the bases that the United States was interested in going after were in the South. The trail from the north, the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply line to the south that went through Laos, through Cambodia, and into the south, those are heavily bombed areas during the war. So, we end up dropping, though, over the course up to 1973, more bombs on Vietnam, 4 million tons, more than we dropped on the entire Pacific theater in World War II. It becomes the most heavily bombed country in history. Laos, per capita, a tiny little landlocked Laos, becomes the most heavily bombed country in the history of the world, per capita basis. And the bombing essentially continues to have no effect throughout the war on enemy morale, on troop movements, on supplies. All that happens is the enemy forces keep growing and growing, and meanwhile we're alienating the Vietnamese villagers and peasants that we're supposedly trying to win the hearts and minds of.
Now, I read something, your opinion on this, the political situation in the United States. I mean, there had been a lot of talk about who lost China.
Right.
And Johnson was anxious not to be the guy who lost Vietnam. So one of his motivations, because if he didn't do this, he felt these guys, they were going to lose right away. Was that accurate?
That was definitely part of the calculation. A lot of this, both for Kennedy and Johnson, basically for any Democrat after Truman, that's when we really start seeing the Democrats branded as being soft on communism or soft on defense, because Truman gets labeled with the lost China. So neither one of them wanted to be seen as losing South Vietnam, even though none of them could articulate the political or the national security relationship of Vietnam or Southeast Asia even really to the United States. So Johnson, that is a big part of the calculation, but at the same time, a lot of people think they sort of stumbled into it and assumed, oh, we can go there and we can win. And in fact, what we now know about both the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations, that very early on, the advisors in the State Department, the CIA, even the Pentagon, were very skeptical about our ability to win a land war or even an air war in Southeast Asia. They knew going well back into 1964, 1965, that the war would very likely end in a stalemate, and still they made the decision to go.
11 more years.
So it ultimately becomes then about credibility. It's not about national security. It's that we said this is important, we committed U.S. forces, and therefore we have to hold to our word. And that's what the war ends up being about for the next 10 years, is America keeping its word and keeping its commitment to its allies.
Because it was just fascinating, because you look at the French who were there for 6 decades, that they could not win a war, and they knew the lay of the land much better than we did coming in when we came in, but we didn't learn anything at all from their defeat. Nothing. We were arrogant about how much we could, in terms of our power, how we'd be able to wield it and get these people to submit, without realizing that the history shows that we probably weren't going to be successful at all in doing what we were going to do.
And Johnson's caught in this bind now, because he at the same time he's committing to this war on poverty, he's committing to creating the Great Society, but the resources that he needs for the Great Society are being drained over there.
One of the key points Martin Luther King Jr.
Exactly.
made,
Exactly.
and eventually led him to come out against the war in 1967, Time to Break Silence, that great speech that he gave at the Riverside Church. But that's one of the key points that he made, that the war on poverty, all the resources are being sucked away over to Vietnam at that point. There's a wall in Washington, D.C. that has 58,000 plus names on it.
Yep.
That was the dead American soldiers. But how many Vietnamese were killed? I hear figures 2 to 4 million. I mean, that's not very precise.
Yeah, it's a range, and unfortunately we don't have a real accurate estimate, in part because so many folks weren't found there, as much as we talk about our POWs and MIAs far more in Vietnam, and also because the records just weren't there prior to the war. But our best estimates are usually in the neighborhood of somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million people in Vietnam, and that goes up a little bit when you start to include Cambodia and Laos, for which the records and the estimates are even lower, but well over 2 million people, just conservatively. 2.5 is a pretty conservative estimate. So, people have done an analysis of what the wall in Vietnam would look like if the Vietnamese walls were on there, and it would basically stretch, the length of the wall, if it was, or the length of the mall, all the way down to the Washington Monument at its present height. And of course, it wouldn't just include the names of soldiers, but women and children and babies and elderly folks who died during the war.
Because there were significant civilian casualties. And in fact, I think one of the facts about this war that Americans just don't want to face up to is what a brutal war it was, and the fact that the United States did commit war crimes that plain and simple were war crimes. I mean, we know about My Lai, My Lai, that was repeated many times. Nick Church, the journalist, has a new book. Let me set him on camera here. Nick Church, Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam. And it's tough reading. Church came across a lot of documentation and interviewed a lot of people, and has really sort of pieced together, probably better than anybody else, just what a brutal war this was, just how many war crimes were actually committed by American soldiers during the course of the war. We can understand, I think, the situation that a lot of young Americans, and most Americans were, what, 19 years old?
As average age of a combat
19.
soldier, 19. Versus 26 in World War II.
Versus 26 in World War II. Most had been drafted. They didn't volunteer to go fight Hitler. They were being drafted into a war, sent. They'd never heard of Vietnam before.
Think of the quote from Phil Caputo's book where he talks about too young to have gone or have been sent. That was a significant quote from his book, from A Rumor of War, where he talks about the stuff that went on there. And he asked those two basic questions to anybody reading. How would you have acted if you went there? And to what lengths would you go to survive? And that's the basis for a lot of what way the soldiers acted there, because they were young, they were immature.
Sure.
This is not what they thought they were signing up for when they got there. It's much the same way it was with young soldiers who went to Iraq. And it's where you see the same sorts of things repeated over and over again.
I think the powerful thing about the Terse book, really, when we think about the issue of war crimes and atrocities in Vietnam, is not that war crimes happened, and certainly, the young people we sent over there were in a difficult spot. But, atrocities and war crimes happen on almost all sides in almost every war, right? The United States also committed war crimes in World War II. The United States also committed war crimes in Korea. We don't talk about them as much because we won those wars. Or at least, achieved a stalemate in the case of Korea. But what Nick points out in that book, and what Chris Happy's done in some of his earlier work, is show that the war crimes weren't aberrations. They weren't committed by a few bad apples, or even just by immature troops who weren't properly trained. It was a function of U.S. policy, that the military strategy that we employed in Vietnam, of the body count, of fighting a war of attrition, of fighting a counterinsurgency in a very problematic way. It was inevitable that these atrocities would happen. It wasn't a matter of choice. The kind of war that we were trying to fight in Vietnam, in a counter-revolutionary situation, it was inevitable. If you're going to fight a counterinsurgency, the best weapon, military strategists in the 60s would have told you, is essentially a bayonet. You go door to door and you isolate enemies and you infiltrate their capacities. Instead, what do we fight it with a B-52. And as much as we talk about things like My Lai and some of the things that Nick talks about, even overwhelming majority of the civilians killed in Vietnam were killed by B-52s who were operating from miles above the earth, not face-to-face, not up-close combat. But then Nick, with the documents that he uncovered, really goes to show that this was part of everyday life in South Vietnam from the mid-60s to the early 1970s. He basically says there was a My Lai going on a month, that we were killing thousands and thousands of civilians intentionally. Every month, not accidentally, but intentionally. It was part of that system, and it's partially because that's who the enemy was. When you're fighting a popular revolution that's part of the people's revolution, the people you're fighting are going to include women. They're going to include younger children and older men. It's not, the war that their fathers fought in World War II. It's a bloody counter-revolutionary struggle, and part of that is because the military policy that the U.S. chose to follow in Vietnam.
And if you think about that, I don't know if you've all probably have seen American Sniper, but there's a really telling scene in the early part of that movie where the sniper's in his sniper's nest and he sees this woman come out with her young son carrying a bomb.
Oh,
That's what you're describing.
Right.
That's the difference between you're going to think you're going to fight an enemy who's going to look like you, who's going to be physically the same size as you or whatever, and you realize when you get over there, this is not what's going on.
Right.
And then what do? How do you act in those situations?
And then what happens afterwards?
Yeah.
That's the post-traumatic stress stuff, and that's the living with the realization that I killed innocent people and kids.
But I guess the point that I would make from my area of expertise in criminology is these were state crimes. That, as you point out, I mean, it's U.S. political leaders who send the military there, who set up the conditions. It's the military, the brass, who make the decision about how to fight this particular war. And so, to a large extent, there were many war crimes committed, but we have to say that these were state crimes, that these were committed by the U.S. and the U.S. military, and I mean, we can identify particular civilian soldiers who killed civilians, and of course, one thinks of the hapless Rusty Calley being, almost completely alone, being branded as the person who carried out My Lai, but we know that this was basically a state crime that was committed here, state crimes that were committed here. So things really start to heat up in 65. What also heated up in 1965 and continuing on in the mid to late 60s was a movement against this war, the anti-war movement. And I think this was perhaps the most important and significant anti-war movement in history. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. I mean, there had always been resistance to a variety of wars, Mexican-American War, and Thoreau's famous piece about that, and World War II even. People don't talk about it, but there was organized opposition among Quakers and other peace activists for a variety of things, but nothing along the scale. And I think what's most telling about the anti-war movement in Vietnam is how sustained it was. That it was heating up already in 64 and 65 immediately on major college campuses across the country. The clergy are immediately involved in ways that are very visible, very early on. It's not 67, 68. 65, the first teach-in at the University of Michigan. I mean, people were there and organized, and they sustained that into the early 1970s. Whereas if you compare that with the organized opposition to the war in Iraq, there was such a huge buildup. It was almost unprecedented prior to the war. But then after the war, in a lot of ways, it just kind of fizzles out. So, I mean, that's really what's, I think, most remarkable about this period is the degree to which that energy was growing and sustained through a really diverse coalition of groups and individuals during that time.
And I think the conditions in the 60s and 70s were optimal for that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Because you already had,
Absolutely.
A strong women's movement going on. You also had a civil rights movement going on. So that movement from home to streets for protest was a whole lot easier. That transition was a whole lot easier. With
And
Vietnam thrown in the mix.
student movement was so strong at that time, and the questioning.
The New Left.
The New Left.
The Students for Democratic Society, Tom
Right.
Hayden's group that he started at the University of Michigan. And of course, they focused on civil rights. I mean, the immediate issue for them was the civil rights movement and what they could do to participate and contribute to that. And then, of course, after Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, it was the issue of poverty. But boom, in the early 60s, the war in Vietnam sort of takes over, and I think the New Left becomes consumed by opposition to the war at that point.
Absolutely.
But it was very broad-based, as you point out.
And you can morph the comments you made earlier about the draft, the unfairness of that too. It also became a civil rights issue too, because it disproportionately fell on poor individuals in this country who ended up going to war.
You could get exempt if you were going to college, and who was going to college, and
Don, you were working in New York City at draft counseling at that time, right?
Yeah, I was.
Anti-draft counseling.
Yes. Well, and I was living in Bushwick section of Brooklyn, which is one of the poorest communities in the United States, and working with one of Martin Luther King's groups, Operation Breadbasket there. So we were working on that, but we joined that with the anti-war movement, and the place that I worked was called Merton Buber House, and it brought together a strong coalition of Jewish leaders, Christian leaders, atheist people that really were tremendous humanitarians. There was a lot of civil disobedience came out of that, taking over draft boards and stuff. We helped a lot of guys get to Canada, and we kept growing. I think that was the thing. At that time, I was a Catholic priest, and I went to a number of hearings before draft boards to testify to help young people get conscientious objector status, which was tough to get because you couldn't just be opposed to Vietnam. You had to be opposed to all war to do that. And so we kind of worked with them to help them do that kind of thing. But I was at the two marches into the Pentagon in the 60s when hundreds of thousands of people were there. But the thing that really is how they lied to the people, how difficult it was to get good information about what was really happening. The systematic lying, which was set up from the very beginning, as you said, Ed.
Yeah. They were saying one thing in the cabinet room and the Situation Room at the White House about how unwinnable this was and it was a stalemate. go out and give a press conference a half hour later. Oh, we're making steady progress. We're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
All these predictions.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately why the Tet Offensive becomes so important. Not because it's a great military shift one way or the other, but because it exposed the lie that the American people and the rest of the world have been hearing for 3 years. That if the enemy was so, beleaguered by what we've been doing for the last 3 years, how were they able to launch this countrywide offensive? It was clear that the end was nowhere in sight, and that the war was not going anywhere as well as people had been led to believe.
And then after that, the Pentagon Papers come out, which verified everything that the people were saying about how they were lying to us.
Right.
One of the iconic events associated with the Tet Offensive was that Walter Cronkite, the famed, revered CBS newscaster, had been to Vietnam and had come back and did a report on the CBS Evening News and basically said, we can't win this war. Right. So it was the combination of the shock of the Tet Offensive and then Uncle Walter, as some people called him. And Johnson is reputed to have said, I don't know if this is true or not, that if I've lost Walter Cronkite,
I've lost
the country.
And then what really, so Johnson does think that, and then immediately McCarthy gets into the race, Bobby Kennedy gets into the race after New Hampshire. In a lot of ways, Tet is the beginning of the end for Johnson because it exposes the lie, and that's when he decides not to run for a second term.
Johnson couldn't go anywhere without being confronted by anti-war demonstrators chanting at him.
And what a tragic figure he is, because he had done so much for civil rights. He had really, I think his vision was really to create a new kind of a society.
Absolutely.
But he could not figure out how to get out of Nam and do that without losing face, which was his big thing. And then at the end, how he was totally abandoned by all his advisors and let to carry the whole thing by himself. He's a tragic figure.
So it opens the door to Richard Nixon getting elected in 1968, taking over 69. Nixon said he's going to end the draft, he's going to end the war.
He's a peace candidate just like Johnson.
Candidate,
Johnson ran as a peace candidate in 64. They're all peace candidates, and then all they do is escalate.
And then, of course, more escalation comes. The Pentagon Papers reveal more truth about the lies that were being told. We just passed the 45th anniversary of the incursion into Cambodia that Nixon ordered, which led to massive anti-war demonstrations across the country. There had been a lot of anti-war demonstrations prior to the April 30th incursion into Cambodia. Ohio State, for example, was shut down for 2 weeks prior to that, and then they just reopened when Nixon went into Cambodia. And of course, what also happened was the Kent State shootings 45 years ago this month. My wife was actually a student at Kent State at the time. And, there's that famous line in Neil Young's song, Four Dead in Ohio. But what if you knew one and found her dead on the ground? Boy, did that strike home to me, because my wife could have been walking right by there at that time. And so that really galvanized the anti-war movement. The other main thing, I think, Ed, the point you made earlier when we were just chatting before we went on the air, is that the significant element of the anti-war movement were the military, the draftees themselves, right?
Yeah. And this is a story, again, a lot of people I think don't know. There's been some good work on it done just over the last 5 or 10 years or so. But the active, the GI movement, the anti-war movement within the military really gains power, especially during the Nixon years. It had been growing, and people, because of the draft and because people had spent time in U.S. bases, we keep calling up people, we eventually call up the reserves, so there's more and more people going over who had been exposed to the war, who knew about the war in ways that guys in 65 didn't. And so now you've got this active organized resistance in the U.S. military, on bases, soldiers who are jailed over there. It grows in the jails in Vietnam. And it really, in a certain points in the early 1970s, almost grinds the military machine to a halt, because people are refusing orders. They start fragging or assassinating their officers. This is really becoming a really messy situation on the ground across southern Vietnam in a way that was almost unprecedented for the U.S. military. And people don't know that story as much, but in a lot of ways, I would argue that that was probably the most effective arm of the anti-war movement in terms of almost stopping the war at a variety of points, and really forced the military to reckon with whether or not they could continue the war in the fashion that they were talking about. So when people talked about further invading Cambodia or invading North Vietnam or expanding the war in any significant way, not only did they not have the troops and they were winding down the draft, but the military itself was in a pretty serious state of disarray around that time.
And I don't think people in the anti-war movement realized how panicky Nixon was getting in the White House, and that he was threatening to use nuclear weapons, and he ordered the Christmas time bombing in '72. At the same time, they were desperately in negotiations to try to conclude the war, and when the event eventually, of course, in a sense, the U.S. is forced out. That was in '73.
January '73, when the peace accords are
peace accords,
signed.
the U.S. troops are withdrawn, and then 2 years later, the North Vietnamese are able to successfully reunite the country. The fall of Saigon in '75. That's the 50th,
And the parallels
40th
between
anniversary.
that and what happened when the French left are, are not lost at all. Just to see how the things tumbled after the French left and after we left too. The very thing we say we were fighting for, that we really didn't have any control over. We never won the hearts and minds of the people there whatsoever.
Parallels.
So the war's over, but the war's not really over, right?
not over.
And so the war continues in other ways. And so I know a lot of your writing focuses on the aftermath, the legacies of the war. So what were some of the more significant aftermaths here?
I think for me, again, one of the things that people don't talk about enough is the embargo that the United States puts on Vietnam during this time. That going in just before the fall of Saigon, Henry Kissinger and then Gerald Ford extend a wartime embargo that had just been on northern Vietnam, which didn't really matter because they were getting their supplies from the Soviets and China, but extends it to what they called Communist Controls Area of Vietnam, which was now the entire country. And that embargo was really brutal, and it was supported by a lot of our allies around the world, in Europe and Australia and elsewhere. And it's really crippling economic sanctions that really hampered Vietnam's ability to rebuild after the war. I mean, since the United States had lost the war, the United States goes home, but the United States homeland had not been attacked. The homeland was fine, morale was bad culturally and things like that, but we destroyed Vietnam. I mean, killed so many people, destroyed a generation, left the city and the infrastructures in ruins. And this embargo stays in place for the next 20 years. And it's really just punitive. There's no good reason to have the embargo in place. But that's really crippling. And so the longer kind of continuation of war by other means stays in place for 20 years until Clinton lifts the embargo in '94, and then we normalize in '95. So that's one. Another one is the environmental devastation that we leave behind, which we don't really come to terms with until later. And it's not just Agent Orange, which is something that I've written about and gotten more play lately, but unexploded ordnance. I mean, the country to this day is littered with unexploded bombs in a lot of areas, especially near the Laotian and Cambodian borders, littered with bombs that are extremely dangerous. Every year, hundreds of people are killed in Vietnam because they step on bombs that have been buried in the ground or not discovered. And so we really made it difficult for Vietnam to move on after the war and to rebuild through the sanctions, because we had destroyed the country and because the United States essentially wanted nothing to do with the region for a little while.
Wash our hands of that, right?
Yeah.
Now, one of the legacies of the war is that we end up portraying ourselves as the victims,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So how does this happen? How does the United States come to view itself, despite all this horrific damage that we've inflicted, to come to see ourselves as some of the victim? And we hear about the Vietnam syndrome. So what's that all about?
There's a couple different elements of things. I think one is cultural, and to a certain degree it's a perfect storm with the kind of cultural narcissism that was going on in the 1970s anyway. But the sense of, for us, the war, and this really begins during the Nixon administration with the focus on POWs and MIAs, which was really a manufactured issue, a manufactured crisis. That begins, it gives Nixon an excuse in some ways to continue and to escalate the war through 1972. But it also begins this shift of look at what Vietnam did to us. And it's not like look at what the war did to us, look at what we did to ourselves. It becomes what did Vietnam do to us? And we blame the Vietnamese and we focus on our veterans and these kinds of issues. But it never in that process do we ever come to terms with what we did to Vietnam. And that's ultimately what Appy writes about in The Reckoning, that we've never come to terms with that. But this idea of victimization begins during the Nixon years. It encompasses a lot of the discussion about the end of the war in '73 and '75. And then really gets proliferated in popular culture with the kind of veterans exploitation films in the 1970s. And ultimately Carter, who's really the first one to give voice to this, when we almost normalized relations with Vietnam in 1978 and '79, but chose to side with China instead. He comes out and gives a press conference where he says, well, there was a lot of destruction, but the destruction was mutual. I mean, it's really a remarkable phrase, and this idea of mutual destruction, that sure, bad things happened to American soldiers in Vietnam, but to compare what happened to the United States in Vietnam versus what we did to the Vietnamese people was just amazing. But Carter gives voice to that as well. And then by the time Reagan comes into office, we've completely revised. You see the first wave of revisionist history about the war, and that it was a noble cause, and it was all these things, never coming to terms with the moral, the ethical, the political, the military failures that really should have defined the war.
Many countries that lose wars develop a sort of a theory of a stab in the back, that we would have won the war if only we hadn't been betrayed on the home front, right?
Absolutely.
And so here, of course, you got the anti-war movement as a candidate. You've got George McGovern and Democratic political leader. So you get this stab in the back theory. We would have won this war if it hadn't been for weak-kneed political leaders who held us back. Now, and some people even say, you know, we fought the war with one hand tied behind our back. I mean, as you pointed out, we dropped more tonnage of explosives on Vietnam than we did in the entire Pacific Theater in World War II. I mean, just if people just let that fact sink in. Vietnam's a tiny little country, and we just bombed the heck out of it, right? And to say that we didn't fight this war to the fullest extent, because we've already said how documented the brutality was. So that's just a completely false narrative, but it becomes part of this. Well, we could have won it if we only would have fought it in the right way, if politicians and the anti-war movement hadn't held us back, right?
Exactly, and that's ultimately what becomes so dangerous about the revisionism, is that it really leads to the remilitarization of American society under Reagan. And again, it's kind of a perfect storm, because the message here is that it was a failure of government, which coincides perfectly with the rise of conservatism under Reagan, that the government is the problem, not the solution. If politicians and the government had gotten out of the way in the 60s and just let the military do what it wanted, well, could the military have destroyed South Vietnam? Sure. But then there's nothing left to save, right? We would have literally burned down the village in order to save it.
Which was a famous quote from the war, right? We had to destroy the village in order to save it, right?
But it's this idea, which goes back to this issue, is, you know, something that's really fundamental: civilian control of the military, political oversight over the military, and there's a strong backlash to that, which is just let the military do what it should do, get out of its way, and let it run its own show, which is not only false in terms of a Vietnam analogy, but really dangerous in terms of what kind of lessons, if any, we learned from Vietnam. That seems to be the primary lesson that the military learns. No more draftees. We want a professional military. We want people who volunteer for this, and we don't want politicians messing around and micromanaging our war. And that, I think, ultimately becomes one of the most dangerous after effects for American society that really proliferates after up into the Gulf War in 90, 91, and then certainly after 9/11 as well.
At the end of the war, well, as the war begins to come down in the early 70s, there's also a reaction against the lies and against the spying on resistors. And so you got the Church Commission out there that begins to put some rules in place about spying. And then later that is totally dismantled as we go on. And so I think what was exposed was how the government lies to its people and how the government goes after anybody that's a resistor. But later on, and not too long, especially as soon as Reagan gets in power, all that is just done away with, and we're back to where we were.
Yeah, I think it's another one. It's really just a missed opportunity. There is this moment in the early to mid 70s where the war and the lies and Watergate and all the upheavals of the 60s should have caused a major reassessment of who we are as a people, where are we going as a country. Again, some of the themes that Appy touches on. But we don't do that. Instead, we kind of bury those. There's this brief moment where Congress is going to, they passed the War Powers Resolution, and they're going to reassert themselves over the executive. That all falls away. We're going to cut down on government surveillance and these kind of things. That falls away. And ultimately, it becomes more about, well, these things are necessary for national security. A strong executive is vital for national security.
Which brings us full circle to what we got during 9/11, which was the Patriot Act.
Exactly.
Yes,
and that's
exactly.
a complete repudiation of all the things that the Church Commission was out to remedy and make sure that didn't happen again. We revisit that completely with the Patriot Act. We go back to these secret wars, these secret activities we can conduct out of necessity. To be able to do whatever we want to do, when we want to do, without limited information given out to the people, and to conduct these wars.
Right. And I think also one of the things that came out in the early 70s too was the actions against the Panthers and against some of the other more militant groups, and the assassinations and the other things that had come in place. But again, in the 80s, it comes back to, no, we got to protect our countries, and that's exactly what happens after 9/11. It's really the shock doctrine. When something happens, we got to jump in there, and the right wing jumps in to shape the whole message in their whole image.
And we know what's best for the country.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, we can't trust these other people.
There's the famous line from George Herbert Walker Bush after the first Gulf War in '91 that, by golly, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome, right?
Yeah.
This was a concern of American political leaders, that the memory of Vietnam and the protests against the war had really limited the ability of American leaders to exert their imperial power in the world, and now we were overcoming that, right?
Right, again, which is based on a total misreading of history. You know, there's no period really in which the United States isn't intervening overseas. I mean, throughout the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is figuring out ways in the Middle East and in certainly Central America, my goodness, to reassert its militarism. And, you know, the Gulf War just continues that, Bosnia and things into the 1990s. I mean, the United States has actively intervened. It's like when people call the 1920s a period of isolationism between the two wars. And throughout that period, the United States is regularly intervening in places like Central America. I mean, there's really no such thing as the Vietnam syndrome. It's really a political problem as much as anything. So if anything, what the Gulf War did was kind of bring to fruition, I think, a systematic effort throughout the 1980s to remilitarize American society, to get the American public fully on board with a full-scale intervention. And it really gives us this very problematic yellow ribbon, support the troops kind of mentality, in the way that you should support the troops, you should not question wars, you should not question foreign policy uncritically. You should not question the decisions, especially once troops are already deployed. And that, I think, is another dangerous outcome of the Vietnam War, based on a complete misreading of the degree to which the American public supported the war and the soldiers in Vietnam.
One of the enduring myths of the Vietnam War is that the veterans that came back were spit upon and treated shabbily. There's actually no documentation at all that any Vietnam veteran, that anybody's aware of, that the Vietnam veterans were spit upon when they came back. In fact, as you point out, the most significant anti-war voices probably were many of those veterans who came back.
Absolutely.
You know, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, John Kerry's Winter Soldier testimony to Congress. I mean, it was the soldiers themselves who were a significant part of that anti-war movement, and yet somehow this myth that they were mistreated when they came back. They might have been mistreated by their own government.
I was going to say that, because they were abandoned. They weren't given the help to reintegrate into the society. They weren't given the help to deal with the drug problems that they picked up over there. They weren't given the help to deal with the post-traumatic stress disorder that all of them experienced.
And they were treated far worse by other veterans than they were from the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement, for the most part, welcomed them in. They saw them for the critical voices that they were. Then they would go to the VFW and connect with veterans from the Korean War and the World War II. And these guys wanted nothing to do with them. There's lots of documentation of the VFW shunning them and calling them losers and blaming the loss in Vietnam on them. And that's the story nobody tells. Everyone wants to focus on the spitting myth and the anti-war movement. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
What are some of the other legacies of the war as we move on now? What about U.S.-Vietnamese relations today, for example? I know that's something.
Well, you know, U.S.-Vietnamese relations right now are as strong as they've ever been. We're the #1 trading partner with Vietnam. We've done joint military exercises with Vietnam. The Vietnamese people have been nothing but opening to Americans, and you know, the Vietnamese were eager to normalize relations immediately after the fall of Saigon. They were ready to move on immediately. And you know, in Vietnam today, the country's tripled since the end of the war in terms of its population. 70% of the country is under the age of 30. They have no memories of the war. They have no legacy of the war. To a certain degree, even elderly Vietnamese sort of, you know, talk about, oh, the kids these days, and they don't remember the wartime because they don't. It's a young, up-and-coming country. It's a really dynamic economy. The interesting dynamic right now in terms of U.S.-Vietnamese relations, I really think has to do more with China. As Obama has talked about his Asian pivot, and as China becomes more aggressive in the region geopolitically, the question is, how is Vietnam going to play that? They've been looking to in a certain way cozy up with the United States, and they've been willing to even consider things like the bilateral trade agreement that we're looking at in Asia, which could be really devastating for the Vietnamese people, for the Vietnamese workers, but is a signal of the degree to which Vietnam is willing to liberalize some of its economy in order to strengthen those ties with the United States, because as it always has, it's trying to protect itself against China.
Yeah.
China has always been the primary concern for Vietnam, going back to the beginning of the first millennia of recorded history.
Didn't Vietnam and China fight a war in the 70s?
They fought, for the better part of the first millennia AD, they were at war in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And and Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were always looking to find a way to sort of balance off China's power. That's why they were willing to make concessions to the French after World War II. That's why they were willing to make concessions to the United States and willing to fight that war and eventually, try to strengthen relations with the U.S. because they were always primarily concerned about China, and that continues to be the case today.
And again, the fact that most Americans don't understand any of that history and the view that we had of monolithic communism at the time, the domino theory. And again, any understanding of the real history on the ground there in Southeast Asia would have,
Well, and it continues to be a problem, right? We don't understand the Sunni-Shia dynamic. Most Americans couldn't tell you the difference between them, and that has led to a complete catastrophe in the United States. And our inability to anticipate a lot of the aftermath that has come up with ISIS and with the sectarian conflict that's gripping that region.
And one of the things, that the lesson not learned, was the tremendous outpouring of military expenditures into Vietnam when we couldn't possibly win. Isn't that the same thing that's happened now in the Middle East? We're pouring more and more and more resources in it with nothing to show for it, and we're deteriorating so much within our own country. And there doesn't seem to be the resistance there that there was during the Vietnam years.
At least during Vietnam, certain people could make the argument that, well, if we fight them here, it will at least buy time for the rest of the region. There was a larger strategy, at least in the Cold War. I mean, I don't buy the idea that Vietnam was actually a coherent part of that strategy. But there was a larger strategy of containment that at least you could make the argument that it was part of. I think my biggest concern about the wars we've been fighting since 9/11 is that there's been no coherent strategy articulated by the Bush administration or by the Obama administration for what does success look like? What are U.S. interests? What will a successful outcome for U.S. investments and expenditures, blood, treasure, what have you, in this region look like? And nobody has an answer to that. And it's not easy, it's not complicated, but if we don't know what we're doing, then how do we know if we're doing it effectively?
Right. And the whole idea is that militarism is the only answer, and we've got to keep upping our militaristic entrance into the whole thing, whereas militarism is getting us nowhere. Exactly. And that's people like Andrew Bacevich and so many other guys that are writing on this are saying, wait a minute.
Yeah.
One thing that I really like about Appy's book is the way in which he discusses the influence of popular culture here. So, for example, we've talked about Reagan, but what about Rambo?
Exactly.
Right? Rambo was just as important in the 80s as was Ronald Reagan, branded in a noble cause. So, can you speak to the issue?
Yeah, and people who weren't, this was right when I was really coming up, was Rambo was a cultural phenomenon. I mean, it was scary and dangerous, in retrospect in a certain way, in that it did contribute to that remilitarization, remasculinization, as people have called it, during the 80s. But to me, the far more dangerous film during that period is actually Platoon. And this is the argument that I've made about Rambo, that Rambo was, militaristic and fascist in a certain sort of way and racist in its view towards the Vietnamese, but it was also so cartoonish and so, ridiculous on so many levels that it was scary that people took it seriously. But Platoon comes along just 2 years later, well, a year later really, it's released in '86. And this is Vietnam the way it really was, and this is the true story. And it's certainly more realistic in a lot of ways, but it's also very dangerous, I think, because the real story of Platoon to me is the story of Charlie Sheen's character goes over and becomes a man, and there's a way in which the war is noble in those views. And when he goes on this big killing spree in the climax of the movie, it's really not that different than Rambo. And I think it recovers a certain kind of militarism about what it's like to go to war and become a man the way it was maybe before Vietnam, when people wanted to be John Wayne, they wanted to be their fathers who fought in World War II. And it's also very dangerous in its view of the Vietnamese. It's not racist in the way that Rambo was with regard to the Vietnamese, but the Vietnamese, this is part of where the title of my first book, Invisible Enemies, came from, that the Vietnamese are nowhere to be seen in Platoon. They're just this pile of bodies in the background. And it becomes, I think, part of that story of how we're never able to come to terms with what we did to Vietnam. Platoon, at the end of the day, is what Vietnam did to us. And so in that way, I think that's actually just as dangerous, if not more so, than Rambo.
And the same is true with Full Metal Jacket, too.
Well, though I think Full Metal Jacket's interesting in a way because it does show the sort of construction of the killing machine and how it is a construction that can then be deconstructed. But it is, it's troubling in some ways.
Another show.
We just have 2 minutes left here. So last thoughts about lessons unlearned from the war. Don, you want to start?
Well, I think one of the lessons is that resistance can work. And I think people now are losing hope. But the resistance to that war made a big difference in a lot of different ways, and I think it could make a big difference today.
Okay. Felix?
And for me, I just think the sanitation of what happened in Vietnam after the war led to the very antecedents that have led us into Iraq and in Afghanistan, and we've repeated the same mistakes by not knowing the politics on the ground, not being interested in what goes on the ground and the rivalries that go on there. We always fought it from the larger lens. And because of that lack of understanding, we find ourselves 10 years later having made no progress at all and not understanding. And now you have ISIS, you have some of these other resistance groups, and the hearts and minds that we told people we were going to win, we never won them because we made the same mistakes that we made in Vietnam there.
Those hearts and minds are elusive, aren't they? Ed, you get the last word.
Well, I think you said it best earlier, Ron, when you were quoting from Chris again, which is that history is always talking to us. We just need to learn how to listen. And unfortunately, we haven't listened and we haven't learned. So if there is one lesson to take away, it's that we should learn how to listen.
Yeah. Well, again, plug the book here. Christian Appy, I don't know if we can get a view of it there. Yeah, there is American Reckoning, and fantastic book, and the way in which he weaves together the music of the period and the films like Rambo and Platoon, and along with the solid history of how we got involved and what happened on the ground. I couldn't put it down once I started to read it. Just a fantastic book. So highly recommended for those, perhaps some of the younger people who don't really have a lot of the background or history. So, well, want to give a shout out to our fantastic technical crew behind the scene: Dan Smith, Larry Mahana, Bob Kilday, our floor director, John Provanchers. Thanks, guys, for all the great work that you do. And we thank you Ed, thank you for being our guest this time. It was great to have you here. Hopefully I'll have you back on this. And we thank you for watching, and we invite you to come back again and see us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.